own ignorance.
But I want to go back to somehow we got away from the idea that the accounts of Socrates are much more thinly sourced than the accounts of Christ, but you are willing to go with the teachings of Socrates, even though they recommend some frankly ill-advised decisions with regards to the city and the state and his own survival.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm not an endorser of... I'm not... There's no such thing as a Socratist, but I admire his method of argument.
Okay, but as to just the simple historical fact, when it comes to the source materials that Dr. Roberts claimed, antiquity, multiplicity, trustworthy scholarly methodology, and quantity and quality of textually ambiguous passages, the accounts of Christ stand up better than any other historical account, Christopher Hitchens. I don't know how you can argue with that.
Well, I don't know how you can assert it, because they're not comparing like with like.
Well, what he was talking about there is the manuscript evidence for the Gospels, and I think on that ground we're in pretty good shape. But something needs to be said, and I think I would agree with you. I wish there was better evidence for Christ. I do indeed. It would be convenient and helpful in a number of ways. If all we had to go on, we who are Christian, was the gospel record, I think we could have confidence, but we would miss a lot. There is so much more for Christians that accounts for why we are Christian than that alone, and that needs to be thrown into the mix, I think.
And we will. When we return, America, Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Dr. Mark Roberts, author of Can We Trust the Gospels? Both books are linked at HughHewitt.com. I recommend them both to you, and we'll come back right after this on The Hugh Hewitt Show. 21 minutes after the hour, America, it's Hugh Hewitt. Thank you for listening to Hugh Hewitt Show. The great God debate continues between Dr. Mark Roberts, author most recently of Can We Trust the Gospels? Pastor, author, blogger, scholar, and friend of mine, and Christopher Hitchens, magnificent author, essayist of Vanity Fair fame, and most recently, God is Not Great, New York Times bestseller. Christopher Hitchens, I was struck in your book, and by the way, I hope you realize this is one of these interviews. I've heard you a few times. Both the guest and the host have actually read your book closely.
No, that's incredibly decent of you.
Twice.
I do
Every word twice.
Very much appreciate it, and I'm very sorry I can't return the compliment to Dr. Roberts, but I shall.
Okay. Now, I was struck when out of the middle of nowhere come the Gnostic Gospels into your account, because it seemed to me unnecessary to anything that you were trying to prove. Why did you bring up the Gnostic Gospels? What point do you think they play in your narrative of discrediting religion?
Because I was clearing the ground for what I wanted later to say about the Quran, about the way in which a text is given authority by pruning the stuff, the garbage out of it, the discrepant bits, the contradictory bits, and so forth, making certain things canonical, discarding others. And because I was very fascinated by what I'd read about the Gospel of Judas.
In the book, you write, for a long time there was incandescent debate over which of the Gospels should be regarded as divinely inspired. Some argued for these and some for others, and many a life was horribly lost on those propositions. Nobody dared say they were all man-abscribed. Long after the supposed drama was over and the revelation of St. John seemed to have been squeezed into the canon because of its author, rather ordinary name. Mark Roberts, you're a scholar of the Gnostic Gospels, and did you find the account compelling, or did it clear the way for the subsequent point made?
Well, it reminded me of things that one can read from certain scholars. It actually didn't remind me of what somebody who's actually studied the Gnostic Gospels would much think about them. For one thing, the Gnostic Gospels almost have nothing that has to do with the actual life of Jesus. They're filled with all kinds of theology, which, if you believe it, you would believe to be quite inspired, and if you don't, you'd believe it to be quite silly. But they have virtually nothing to say about the historical life of Jesus, and so in that regard, they're just not terribly helpful. Plus, they were written at least, or on average at any rate, a century later than the biblical Gospels. So the Gnostic Gospels don't really help us much at all if our desire is to know something of Jesus. They're fascinating in and of themselves, but more...
The Gospel of Judas has a lot about Jesus in it.
Well, but you actually read that, and I appreciate that. You gave almost a page to it. But what it tells us about Jesus is it has absolutely nothing to do with what he did. It has some sayings of Jesus and in language that almost 100% certain is nothing Jesus himself would have actually said, because it sounds nothing like what a first century Jew would say.
Surely it answers a question that is raised necessarily by the accepted account of the last Passover, which is this: why is Judas considered to be a bad person when he's only doing God's will.
I agree with you there. It answers that because for the Gnostic, the physical body is bad and evil, and in the Gospel of Judas, Judas is the one who is going to get rid of the physical body of Jesus. And so for the Gnostics, Judas is the hero. He got rid of the body so that the real Christ, non-physical Christ, could sort of be set free, and that's why Judas is the hero. It does exonerate him. I'm not sure it does it in a way that has much historical persuasiveness to it.
Well, you certainly have me there. I don't think it's historical at all. I think it's another fabrication, but still, it makes a mystery a little less mysterious.
But why is it?
I mean, why do you think? I'll put the question to you this way. I know you're not a Catholic, but the Church of Rome waited until 1965, 20 years after the end of the final solution in Europe, to acquit the Jewish people of the charge of deicide. Not some Jews, but all Jews. Why do you think it took them so long?
Well, I think there I'd want to take a page out of your book and say that human beings are insufficiently rational.
But it's been a dogma preached very fervently for a long, long time in the name of someone who claims you don't support his claim. I don't know on what basis you don't. To hold the keys of St. Peter, and who shares a lot of your beliefs. Now, I think I do know why. Because if these events, or some version of them, did occur, the certainty is there were a lot of Jews around. And if they're told that they're absolved of responsibility, then it becomes extremely difficult to say to the rest of the human race, you were responsible for Calvary as well. That's why they couldn't let them go. That's why this massive injustice was committed, not as an aberration of Christianity, but as part of its central teaching for the greater part of its existence, and hasn't been sincerely, in my view, repudiated.
Well, then that is lacking. All I can say is on this count, I am with you completely that the anti-Judaism of much of Christian history is extraordinarily inconsistent with what Christianity ought to be. And you'll get no defense from me. You and I are of common mind in thinking that's terrible. I'd go the step further to say that it's also terrible history, because when you look carefully at the gospel records, you discover that the vast majority of the Jews were in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death were abhorred by it.
Is it inconsistent? Is it inconsistent, Dr. Roberts, with the teachings of Jesus and the explanation of those teachings of Paul?
Oh, extraordinarily so. So it's one of the. There is definitely a problem. And I will agree that this is a problem for Christians, that so many Christians have both thought things we ought not to have thought and done things we ought not to have done. And obviously that's even more disturbing to me as a Christian, because I have a certain brotherhood and sisterhood with some of these folk. It's a terrible mark on our record.
Well, it ought to be said, and I add it, that Maimonides, the great Jewish sage, thought it was one of the best days' work the Jewish people had ever done. That the elders did exactly the right thing by putting to death this ghastly heretic and impostor.
Well, that didn't help much, did it?
So I've no sympathy with Judaism either. But it is said, is it not, that the Jews called for his blood to be on their heads and on their descendants to the remotest generation, an echo of the preamble to the Ten Commandments, where it is said that the sins of the fathers will be visited on their children. I do not regard this as moral preaching. Do you? Is it right to say that the sins of fathers shall be visited on their children and their children's children? Is it moral to say that, let alone truthful?
Well, I think it's certainly truthful. Whether it's moral depends on what sins and the way in which it's visited. I think it's certainly truthful that my children, unfortunately, are going to carry on some of my own sins. Now, I don't think that's moral. I don't break it. I think that there are situations in which it may well be moral.
That's not correct. They may go on sinning. They're doomed to, apparently. But are they going to suffer for yours?
Well, I think that is...
Are their children going to be held responsible for your sins? That's what it says.
I think it is true that they will continue to suffer for my sin. I think the question of when it is moral for that to happen is not one that I could give a yes-no answer to.
I'll be right back, Christopher Hitchens and Mark Roberts, and we continue on the great God debate when we return to the Hugh Hewitt Show.